Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's case, I'd like to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Now let's get into the story. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled my truck off the narrow dirt road, parking it parallel to the Colorado River. The early evening sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft orange glow over the landscape. The forest loomed behind me, thick with towering pines and a sense of untamed wilderness that stretched for miles. This was exactly what I needed, a break from the noise and stress of life. Just me, the river, and a crackling campfire. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was almost disorienting. No traffic, no buzzing electronics, no voices. Just the hum of nature, the faint gurgling of the river, and the occasional chirp of distant birds. Perfect, I muttered to myself, stepping out of the truck and breathing in the fresh, pine-scented air. I moved to the back, lowering the tailgate and hauling out my gear. A simple tent, my sleeping bag, and a cooler filled with enough supplies for the night. Setting up camp was easy. I'd done it 100 times before. The ground was soft but dry, the perfect spot to stake down the tent, just a few feet from the water's edge. The river was calmer here, with a steady, soothing current. As I unrolled the tent and started threading the poles, I noticed how the evening breeze gently rustled the leaves of the nearby trees. It felt peaceful. Too peaceful, maybe. The kind of peace that always seemed just a little unnatural. But I shrugged it off. This was the kind of quiet I'd been craving for weeks. Could use a little music, I muttered, chuckling at the irony. I wasn't going to ruin the atmosphere with noise, but the eerie stillness was getting to me. By the time the tent was pitched and the campfire started, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only a faint glow behind the trees. The fire crackled and popped as I leaned back in my folding chair, staring into the flames, letting the warmth seep into my skin. That was when I first noticed it, the stillness. The wind had stopped. The leaves were no longer swaying. The river was the only thing making noise now. And it felt wrong somehow, like the forest had gone quiet for a reason. I straightened in my chair, my eyes scanning the darkening tree line. Must be the night settling in, I said, trying to shake off the sudden wave of unease. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. The quiet deepened, the air thickened. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I reached for the stick I'd been using to stoke the fire, poking at the embers to keep my hands busy. A heavy, uneasy sensation crept over me, and my skin prickled. I couldn't explain it, but I felt watched. Suddenly, there was a faint sound from the woods behind me, just barely audible over the crackling fire. But there, it sounded like heavy footsteps, like something large moving slowly through the brush. I whipped around, pointing my flashlight into the dense trees, the beam cutting through the shadows. Nothing, just darkness and the silent forest staring back at me. My heart pounded a little harder in my chest, but I told myself it was nothing. A deer maybe, or a bear. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I hadn't seen any sign of them on my way in. Besides, the fire would keep most animals at bay. I turned back to the fire, trying to relax, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. I stared into the flames, but my mind was no longer on the crackling warmth. I listened intently to the silence, every tiny sound amplified by my own nerves. A sharp snap of a branch made me jump. This time, the sound came from closer to the riverbank. My flashlight flicked on again, its beam sweeping across the water's edge. Again, nothing. Just rocks and the gentle flow of the river. Get it together, Ford, I muttered under my breath. You're letting the quiet get to you. I clicked the flashlight off and threw more wood onto the fire, the flames leaping higher in response. I had been camping enough to know the sounds of the woods, creaking branches, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But this was different. It felt deliberate, like something was pacing the perimeter of my camp, watching me from the shadows. Shaking off the paranoia, I climbed into the tent, hoping the walls of nylon would give me some sense of security. I zipped the door shut and laid back on my sleeping bag, listening to the night. The fire outside cast a faint glow, flickering through the thin walls of the tent, but everything beyond was darkness. I was just drifting off to sleep when it happened again. Footsteps. Heavy ones, unmistakable this time, crunching on the gravel near the riverbank. I sat up instantly, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, straining to hear. My hand trembled as I reached for the flashlight again. Slowly, I unzipped the tent and shone the light toward the sound. The beam caught nothing but the riverbank. My truck stood parked just where I'd left it. The trees swayed gently in the distance. But the sense of being watched, of something just beyond the edges of the light, gnawed at me. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the mud near the water's edge, huge footprints. They were too large for any animal I knew of, bigger even than the tracks left by a bear. The prints led away from the river and disappeared into the thick brush on the other side of the camp. Hell no, I whispered under my breath, scanning the area with my flashlight again. I was about to back into the tent when I heard it, low, guttural, like a growl, but deeper, more menacing than anything I'd ever heard before. It sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Whatever was out there was close. Too close. My flashlight flickered, and I felt my heart drop. Then, just as suddenly as the growl had come, the forest went silent again. I waited, tense, for what felt like hours but was probably just minutes. No more sounds. No more footsteps. I retreated into the tent, zipping it shut behind me, my hands shaking. Sleep was out of the question now. I sat there, flashlight clutched tightly in my grip, listening, waiting for whatever it was to return. The fire outside began to die down, casting the campsite in shadow. As the hours dragged on, the silence stretched, suffocating in its weight. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I lay down, still fully dressed, my heart racing even as my eyes closed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the trees, waiting just out of sight. I woke up to the sound of something heavy crashing through the underbrush, as if a freight train was plowing through the forest behind me. My heart jackhammered against my ribs, jolting me fully awake. It wasn't just the wind or some deer moving through the trees. This was something bigger, much bigger. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers numb and clumsy as they closed around it. The tent was filled with the oppressive silence of the wilderness at night, broken only by the sound of those heavy footsteps. They were getting closer, each one crunching the dried leaves and snapping branches underfoot. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I unzipped the tent door. The night air was sharp and cold, but I hardly noticed as I pointed the beam into the thick darkness of the forest. That's when I saw it, just for a second, a hulking figure moving between the trees, its massive form backlit by the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. It was tall, far taller than any man, with broad shoulders and matted fur covering its body. And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there. What the hell? I whispered to myself, my throat tight with fear. I could still hear the thing moving, though now it seemed to be circling the camp, its footsteps slow and deliberate. Whatever it wasn't in any rush, and that only made it worse. It knew I was here. It wasn't afraid. I crouched low by the tent's entrance, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark but showing me nothing. The crashing had stopped, replaced by an eerie, thick silence, as if the whole forest had gone still again. No wind. No insects. Nothing but my own shaky breath and the pounding of my heart in my ears. And then I smelled it. The rank stench of decay hit me like a wall, thick and nauseating. It was like something had been rotting in the woods for days, left to fester and boil under the sun. The smell clung to the air, making my stomach churn. I stood up slowly, stepping out of the tent, my flashlight still flicking back and forth across the tree line. My mouth was dry, my skin crawling. I couldn't see the creature anymore, but the sense of its presence, lurking just beyond the range of my light, was overwhelming. I took a few cautious steps forward, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run, but I needed to know what this thing was. My rational mind clung to the idea that maybe it was a bear, some oversized grizzly. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. No bear moved like that. No bear smelled like that. Just as I reached the edge of the river, my foot slipped in the mud, and my flashlight beam jerked wildly, catching something on the ground. I froze, staring down at the massive footprints pressed into the wet earth. They were enormous, at least twice the size of my own boot, with deep, clawed impressions. My stomach dropped. This thing wasn't just big, it was something else entirely. What the hell made these? I whispered to no one in particular, my voice barely a croak. Before I could process what I was seeing, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, coming from somewhere deep in the trees behind me. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. It was wrong, more primal, more threatening. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the darkness. For a split second, I caught sight of a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the beam, watching me from between the trees. They were too high off the ground, far too high, and they were fixed on me with a predatory stillness that made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping in the mud again, but I kept the light trained on where I had seen those eyes. The growling stopped, but the creature didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for something, waiting for me to make a mistake. "This can't be real," I muttered, my voice shaking. "This isn't happening." But it was happening, and I knew it. There was no denying what I was seeing, what I was hearing. This wasn't just some animal. It was something else, something bigger, something dangerous. Something that wasn't supposed to exist. The wind shifted, and the rancid smell of decay hit me again, stronger this time, making my eyes water. My mind raced. What the hell was I supposed to do? Run? Stand my ground? Try to scare it off? But deep down, I knew that none of those options were going to work. This thing wasn't afraid of me, and it wasn't going to leave. I backed up slowly, keeping my light trained on the spot where I had seen the eyes. They had disappeared again, but I could still feel the creature's presence, still hear its slow, deliberate breathing in the distance. As I reached the edge of my camp, I considered making a run for the truck, but that meant turning my back on whatever was out there, and the idea of it coming after me while I wasn't looking made my blood run cold. I had to make a decision. I couldn't just stand here and wait for it to strike. With one last glance toward the dark forest, I grabbed my cooler, fumbling with the latch. I pulled out the small flare gun I always kept for emergencies, my hands trembling. It wasn't much, but it was the only weapon I had. I loaded the flare and raised it, pointing it into the trees. My heart pounded as I pulled the trigger, the flare exploding from the barrel with a sharp crack, lighting up the sky in a burst of red. For a brief moment, the entire forest was illuminated, and I saw it. The creature stood between two thick trees, its massive, ape-like body hunched over, its fur matted and covered in dirt. Its face! I'll never forget that face. It was animalistic, yes, but there was something almost human about its eyes, something malicious, something cold. Its lips curled back, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth as it snarled at the light, its muscles tensing as if preparing to charge. And then the flare began to fizzle out, and the darkness rushed back in, swallowing the creature whole. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The forest was silent again, but the damage was done. I had seen it. I knew what was out there now, and it was hunting me. The footsteps started again, heavier and faster this time, crashing through the brush like a bulldozer. My blood turned to ice. Without thinking, I turned and ran. "Jesus!" I gasped, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "This isn't happening." The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, as I sprinted toward the river, my mind screaming at me to get as far away from that thing as possible. The water ahead was dark, cold, but it didn't matter. It was my only shot. I could hear the creature's growls now, closer than ever, and the sound of trees snapping like twigs as it barreled through the woods toward me. There was no time to think, only time to run. The moment my feet hit the riverbank, I knew I wasn't going to make it. The sound of crashing underbrush behind me was deafening, like a freight train barreling through the trees. Each footstep pounded the earth, shaking the ground beneath me. Whatever was chasing me was close, too close. "Come on, come on!" I gasped to myself, my legs burning with the effort as I sprinted for the river. The river was my only chance. If I could get to the other side, I might stand a chance of losing it, whatever it was. The freezing water stretched ahead, dark and unforgiving in the pale light of the moon. I could feel the creature behind me, its presence overwhelming, the stench of decay so thick I could almost taste it. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart slamming in my chest, and for a split second, I saw it again, a massive shadow, hulking and furious, barreling through the trees toward me. Its eyes were glowing in the faint moonlight, filled with a kind of primal rage I had never seen before. It was gaining on me. Without a second thought, I plunged into the icy water, the shock of the cold hitting me like a punch to the gut. The current was stronger than I had anticipated, pulling at my legs, threatening to drag me under. But I didn't stop. I kicked hard, pushing through the numbing chill, my lungs burning as I fought to stay afloat, my ears filled with the roar of the river, and for a moment, I dared to hope the water might slow it down, might give me a chance to escape. But then I heard it, splashing. The creature had followed me into the river. "God, no," I whispered, my voice trembling as I paddled harder, my arms flailing against the relentless current. The water surged around me, and I risked another glance back. The creature was wading through the river, its massive body plowing through the current like it was nothing. Its thick, matted fur was drenched, but it didn't seem to care. It was focused on me, its eyes locked onto mine, filled with a terrible, animalistic hunger. I pushed harder, my muscles screaming in protest, but the river was merciless. It pulled at me, dragging me downstream. I couldn't see the opposite shore anymore, just the black water and the looming silhouette of the creature behind me, getting closer. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, cutting through the roar of the river. I wasn't going to make it. The realization hit me like a sledgehammer, and panic surged through me. My mind raced, searching for any possible way out, but there was nothing. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. I kicked harder, my legs burning with effort, but the current pulled me farther downstream. The creature was still in pursuit, its massive form cutting through the water like a predator closing in on its prey. My arms were starting to feel like lead, each stroke weaker than the last, and I could feel my strength slipping away. I had to reach the other side. It was my only chance. I glanced to the left, searching desperately for a shallower stretch of water, and there, just a little farther downstream, I saw a rocky ledge. It was close, maybe 50 feet away, but it felt like miles. "Come on, Ford," I growled through gritted teeth, forcing my arms and legs to keep moving. With one final, desperate push, I reached the edge of the riverbank. My hands scrambled for purchase on the slick rocks, my fingers slipping as I pulled myself out of the water. Every muscle in my body screamed in agony, but I didn't care. I had made it. For a moment, I lay there, gasping for breath, my body shaking from the cold and the effort. But I didn't have time to rest. The creature was still in the water, still coming for me. I could hear its heavy breathing now, deep and labored, as it fought against the current. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. My head swam with exhaustion, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I stumbled up the rocky shore, my boots slipping on the slick stones, but I kept moving. I had to put as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. I looked back one last time, and there it was, still in the river, its massive form illuminated by the faint light of the moon. Its eyes locked onto mine, filled with a burning primal rage. But it wasn't following me anymore. It stood there, waist deep in the river, watching me, its lips curled back in a snarl. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. It wasn't just an animal. There was something more in those eyes, something intelligent, something that understood exactly what I was doing. It wasn't giving up, not yet. It let out a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill down my spine, and then slowly it backed away, disappearing into the dark water. I collapsed onto the rocks, my body shaking with exhaustion and cold, my mind reeling from what I had just seen. The night air felt sharp in my lungs as I gasped for breath, the icy chill of the water still clinging to my skin. For a long time, I just lay there staring at the river, waiting for it to come back. But the water remained still, the creature gone. I didn't know how long I sat there, my mind spinning with disbelief and fear. Minutes? Hours? The world around me seemed frozen in place, the sounds of the forest muffled by the roaring in my ears. Eventually, I forced myself to move, pulling myself to my feet with shaky legs. I had to get out of here. I had to find help. I stumbled up the riverbank, glancing back at the water every few steps, half expecting the creature to rise up from the depths and come after me again. But it didn't. The river was quiet now, as if nothing had ever happened. When I finally reached the truck, I collapsed against the side, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. My body felt like it had been through a war, every muscle aching, my skin cold and damp. But the worst part wasn't the exhaustion or the cold. It was the fear. The knowledge that something was out there, something real, something terrifying. I climbed into the truck and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me, as if that thin barrier of metal and glass could somehow protect me from what I had seen. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. What the hell was that thing? I stared out at the river, my mind spinning with the question, but there were no answers. Only fear. Only the memory of those eyes watching me from the darkness, and the knowledge that I had barely escaped with my life. But I knew one thing for certain, it wasn't over. That thing was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And somehow, I had a feeling it wasn't done with me yet. I collapsed onto the rocky shore, the cold night air biting at my skin as I gasped for breath. My body ached, muscles burning from the desperate swim, but I didn't care. I was alive. I made it across the river, but the sense of relief that should have come never arrived. I knew I wasn't safe. Not yet. I forced myself to sit up, still panting as I turned to look back across the river. The water flowed calmly now, as if nothing had happened, as if it wasn't the sight of a chase that nearly killed me. My eyes darted to the opposite shore, scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of the creature. And there it was. The beast was pacing along the riverbank, its massive form barely visible in the dim moonlight. I could see its broad shoulders hunched as it moved, its long arms hanging by its sides, powerful legs carrying its weight with terrifying ease. It hadn't crossed the river. Not yet. It was just standing there, its eyes locked onto me like I was still prey. I shuddered, backing up a few steps, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. The distance between us didn't feel like much of a barrier. It was as if the river was the only thing keeping it from tearing me apart, and I had no idea how long that would last. The creature stopped pacing and let out a low, rumbling growl. I felt the vibration of it in my bones, even from across the river. It was a sound of anger, frustration. It couldn't reach me, but it wanted to. And it wasn't going to forget that I had escaped. I swallowed hard, wiping a hand across my forehead, slick with sweat despite the cold. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The creature didn't answer, of course. It just stood there, staring at me, watching, waiting. Its glowing eyes were filled with a primal fury, something ancient and terrifying that sent chills down my spine. After what felt like an eternity, it finally moved. But instead of charging into the water, it did something that made my blood run cold. It turned its back on me and disappeared into the trees, fading into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. I stood there frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was dread. The creature was gone, but I knew it wasn't finished with me. It was just biding its time. I forced myself to move, stumbling over the rocks as I made my way farther up the shore. The cold water still clung to my clothes, and my boots squelched with each step, but I couldn't stay here. I had to find shelter, somewhere safe, somewhere I could regroup, figure out what to do next. I glanced back over my shoulder one last time, but the river was empty. No sign of the creature. It was gone. But I didn't trust that for a second. The night felt endless as I walked along the riverbank, my body aching with exhaustion. I hadn't gone far, just enough to put some distance between me and the spot where I'd crossed. I found a cluster of boulders near the water's edge, huddled together like ancient sentinels, and collapsed behind them. The rocks weren't much of a hiding place, but at least they gave me some cover. I sat there, my back pressed against the cold stone, staring out at the river. My mind was racing, replaying the events of the past few hours over and over again, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of. It was something else, something bigger, stronger, and far more dangerous. And it was hunting me. There was no denying that now. The silence was oppressive, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The river gurgled softly nearby, its current gentle and deceptive, as if mocking the chaos that had just unfolded. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, but there was no other sound. No crickets, no owls. Even the night itself felt wrong, like the world had emptied out, leaving me alone with the terror that stalked the woods. I gripped my arms tightly, trying to stop the shivering, but it wasn't just from the cold. The fear still clung to me like a second skin, refusing to let go. "I've got to get out of here," I whispered to myself, the words sounding hollow in the darkness. But where could I go? The nearest town was miles away, and there was no guarantee I could outrun this thing if it decided to come after me again. And I had no idea if anyone would even believe me if I told them what I'd seen. Who would? "You're just scared of a bear," I imagined the sheriff saying, dismissing my story with a wave. Or maybe a wolf. People see things all the time. But this wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a wolf. I'd seen its eyes. I'd felt its intent. This thing wasn't just an animal. It was something worse, something evil. I tightened my grip on the flare gun. It had worked once, startling the creature just long enough for me to make my escape. But now I was down to my last flare, and I knew it wouldn't be enough if the thing came back. The hours dragged on, each second stretching into an eternity as I sat there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the creature didn't return. The forest remained quiet, the river a constant companion in the suffocating stillness. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, the sky began to lighten. The first hint of dawn crept over the horizon, bathing the river in a soft, gray light. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir me into action. I forced myself to stand, every muscle protesting as I pulled myself up from the rocks. My legs wobbled beneath me, exhaustion threatening to drag me back down, but I couldn't afford to stop. I had to keep moving, had to get away from here. The creature might have disappeared into the night, but I knew better than to think it was gone for good. It was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. I started walking again, my steps slow and unsteady, my mind still foggy with exhaustion. But with each step, I felt a little stronger. The daylight gave me something to hold on to, a glimmer of hope that maybe I could make it out of this alive. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The river flowed calmly beside me, the trees rustling in the early morning breeze. But somewhere, hidden in the shadows of the forest, I knew the creature was there. It hadn't forgotten about me, and it wasn't going to stop until it finished what it had started. I took one last look across the river, toward the spot where the creature had vanished into the trees. "I'll be ready for you," I whispered, my voice low and filled with a defiance I didn't entirely feel. Then I turned and kept walking, the river at my side, the fear gnawing at my insides like a festering wound. It wasn't over. Not yet. The morning light was harsh, almost too bright after the long, dark night. I hadn't slept, not really. My mind wouldn't allow it, not with the memory of that thing burned into my thoughts, its eyes, its massive, hulking form. Even with the sun rising higher in the sky, the chill in my bones remained. It wasn't just the cold from the river, it was the terror, still gnawing at the edges of my mind. I had to go back. As much as I wanted to leave, to drive as far from this place as I could and never look back, I couldn't. I needed my gear. My wallet, phone, everything was still at the campsite. If I just left it all behind, I'd have nothing. And then there was the question of proof. I had to know if there was any sign left of what had happened last night. Maybe it had all been a nightmare, a vivid, horrifying hallucination. That's what I kept telling myself as I walked along the riverbank, heading back toward the spot where I had camped. Maybe the exhaustion had made me see things that weren't there. But deep down I knew better. As I trudged through the woods, my heart pounded with each step. The trees were tall and silent around me, but not the peaceful silence I had initially come here for. This silence was oppressive, eerie, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I came around the bend in the river, and there it was, my campsite, or what was left of it. My breath caught in my throat. The place looked like a tornado had ripped through it. The tent was shredded, nothing more than scraps of fabric fluttering in the breeze. My gear was scattered across the ground, some of it smashed, some of it completely unrecognizable. The campfire had been kicked apart, the blackened rocks flung across the clearing like toys. But that wasn't what sent a shiver down my spine. It was the claw marks. They were everywhere. Deep gouges cut into the trees around the campsite, long, vicious slashes that left the bark splintered and raw. Some of the marks were so deep the trees oozed sap, like they were bleeding. And then there were the footprints, massive, unmistakable, pressed into the soft dirt, circling the camp. "Jesus Christ," I whispered under my breath. I knelt down next to one of the footprints, my fingers trembling as I traced the outline. It was enormous, far bigger than any human foot, with long, sharp claws at the tips. There was no way this was a bear. Bears didn't walk upright like that, and they certainly didn't leave marks like these. The smell of decay still lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable. It clung to the ruins of my camp like a foul, invisible presence. The memory of that smell from last night flooded back, and my stomach twisted in knots. I stood up and stumbled back from the footprint, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't stay here. I needed to grab what I could and get the hell out of these woods. There was no telling if that thing was still watching me from the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I grabbed my pack, one of the few things that hadn't been completely destroyed, and started shoving what little gear was left into it. Most of it was useless now. My flashlight was broken, the cooler had been smashed open, food scattered everywhere. My phone was nowhere to be found. I scanned the ground frantically, kicking aside pieces of debris, but it was gone. Probably crushed underfoot during the creature's rampage. "Damn it," I muttered, feeling the rising panic clawing at my chest. I stood up straight, my eyes darting around the perimeter of the campsite. The claw marks, the footprints, the destruction, it was undeniable now. This thing wasn't just some hallucination. It was real, and it was angry. I had to tell someone. I had to report this, show them the evidence. But how? How could I explain any of this without sounding like a lunatic? A creature taller than a man, with glowing eyes and massive claws? Who would believe me? I shoved the last of my supplies into the pack and zipped it up, slinging it over my shoulder. There wasn't much else I could salvage. Just as I was about to turn and leave, something glinted in the dirt, catching the sunlight. I crouched down and picked it up, a knife. My hunting knife. The blade was bent, the metal scratched and scarred. It must have been knocked out of my pack in the chaos, but I could still feel the weight of it in my hand, solid and reassuring. I tucked the knife into my belt and stood up, scanning the forest one last time. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away, and every rustle in the leaves made my heart skip a beat. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches above, but that wasn't what had my attention. It was the silence. Again, no birds, no insects, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. The forest was waiting, watching, and I wasn't about to stick around to see what happened next. I turned and started making my way back toward the truck, my footsteps quick and deliberate. The pack on my back felt heavier than it should have, every step filled with the weight of fear pressing down on me. My mind raced, replaying the events of last night, trying to figure out what the hell that thing was. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, nothing made sense. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard of. It was something else, something far more dangerous. As I reached the edge of the forest, the truck came into view, parked right where I had left it. Relief washed over me, and I quickened my pace, my eyes constantly darting around, expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I climbed into the truck and slammed the door shut, locking it instinctively, even though I knew it wouldn't stop whatever was out there. My hands were trembling as I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was spinning, replaying everything I had seen. I had to report this. There was no way I could leave this place without telling someone what had happened. But as I stared out at the trees, at the place where my campsite had once been, a sinking feeling crept into my gut. No one was going to believe me. The thought hit me like a punch to the stomach. Even with the claw marks, the footprints, the destruction, what was I going to say? That I had been chased by a monster in the woods? They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. But I wasn't. I knew what I saw. With one last look at the forest, I threw the truck into drive and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dust as I sped down the dirt road. I wasn't coming back. Not for anything. By the time I reached the small town down the highway, the sun was high in the sky, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving light. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so hard, and my mind buzzed with the chaos of what I had just survived. I couldn't drive fast enough. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, who might understand, who might help. The sheriff's office sat at the end of the main street, a squat, brick building that looked more like an old post office than a place where you went to report something terrifying and unexplainable. My truck skidded to a stop outside, and I practically fell out of the driver's seat, my legs shaky and weak from the adrenaline still coursing through me. I slammed the door shut and made my way to the front entrance, trying to steady my breath. The office inside was small and quiet, just a few desks scattered around with paperwork piled up in neat stacks. A bored-looking deputy sat behind the front counter, sipping coffee and scrolling through something on his phone. He looked up as I entered, his brow furrowing slightly at my disheveled appearance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cautious but not overly concerned. I nodded, swallowing hard. My mouth felt dry, like I hadn't had water in days. "Yeah, I need to talk to the sheriff." "It's urgent," I said, my voice cracking with the strain of the past 24 hours. Something attacked my campsite." The deputy raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting that. He set his coffee down and straightened up in his chair, the bored expression giving way to mild interest. "Attacked, huh? What kind of something?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. I glanced around the room, feeling a surge of frustration and panic welling up inside me. This wasn't just a normal something. How the hell was I supposed to explain this? But I didn't have time for self-doubt. I had to get them to believe me. "I don't know exactly," I admitted, my voice shaky. "But it was big. Like, really big. I think it might have been a bear, but..." I stopped myself, realizing how stupid that sounded. No, it wasn't a bear. It was something else. It chased me through the woods, destroyed my campsite. The door to the back office opened, and an older man with graying hair and a thick mustache stepped out. He was wearing a sheriff's badge over his worn-out flannel shirt, looking every bit like a guy who'd rather be fishing than dealing with panicked campers. "What's all this?" the sheriff asked, crossing his arms as he surveyed me. I took a deep breath, trying to gather my thoughts. "Sheriff, I was camping out by the Colorado River last night. Something, I don't know what it was, but it came out of the woods and chased me. I barely made it across the river. When I got back this morning, my campsite was torn apart. There were claw marks on the trees, huge footprints in the mud. There's no way this was just a bear. I've never seen anything like it." The sheriff didn't look impressed. He exchanged a glance with the deputy, who was clearly trying not to smirk. I could feel the disbelief radiating off both of them. "Okay," the sheriff said slowly, clearly choosing his words carefully. You're saying something attacked your campsite, chased you through the woods, and what? Disappeared? Yes, I replied, my voice louder than I intended. It wasn't a bear. I don't know what it was, but it was huge. I saw it, up close. I swear to God, this thing it wasn't natural. The sheriff's face didn't change. He just scratched his mustache and gave me a long, hard look. Son, it sounds to me like you had a run-in with a bear, or maybe a mountain lion. It happens out here. They get territorial. As for the campsite, well, animals can do a lot of damage if they're hungry or angry enough. I shook my head, frustration boiling over. I couldn't believe this. They weren't taking me seriously. It wasn't a bear, I said, enunciating each word carefully. This thing was walking on 2 legs. It was tall, like 7 or 8 feet at least. And it was fast, faster than anything I've ever seen. The deputy snorted under his breath, earning a sharp look from the sheriff. The sheriff sighed and leaned against the counter, folding his arms. Look, I get it, he said in a tone that suggested he didn't. You've had a long night, you're rattled. Maybe you saw something you couldn't explain. But out here in the woods, it's easy to let your mind play tricks on you, especially when it's dark and you're alone. I stared at him in disbelief. My fists clenched at my sides. I had seen it. I had felt the terror, the malice in its eyes. This wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Come out to the campsite, I urged. See the claw marks? The footprints are still there. You'll understand once you see it. The sheriff raised his eyebrows, clearly unconvinced. He glanced at the deputy, who shrugged in a way that said, I've seen crazier things from campers, all right, the sheriff said after a moment, his voice laced with patronizing patience. I'll send someone out to take a look, but I'm telling you, it's probably just a bear. My heart sank. They weren't going to take this seriously. The sheriff was humoring me, nothing more. Even if they did come out to the campsite, they'd just chalk it up to some wild animal. They weren't going to believe what I had seen. No, I said, shaking my head. You don't understand. It's not a bear. It's something else. Something dangerous. I don't care what you think, but it's out there, and it's hunting. The sheriff held up a hand to stop me, his expression softening a little, though it was still filled with doubt. Son, I've been sheriff in this town for 20 years. I've seen plenty of strange things out there in the woods, but I've never seen anything that couldn't be explained by natural causes. His words felt like a punch to the gut. I had come here hoping for help, for someone to take me seriously, but all I was getting was a pat on the head and a dismissive smile. I turned and stormed out of the office, my frustration bubbling over. I knew what I had seen. I knew the danger I had barely escaped from. But no one would believe me. Not here. Not anywhere. As I climbed back into the truck, I sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The anger and frustration swirled inside me, but beneath it all was a gnawing fear. That thing was still out there. It had chased me through the woods, torn apart my campsite, and now it was probably stalking the same forest, waiting for its next chance. I started the truck, my hands shaking slightly, as I pulled out onto the road. No one believed me, but I knew what I had seen, and I had a feeling I wasn't the only one who had ever encountered that creature. But without proof, I was just another crazy camper with a wild story. The thought hit me hard, settling like a stone in my chest. No matter what I said, what I tried to show them, I was going to have to live with this alone. And worse than that, I knew it wasn't over. The drive back to my cabin felt like a blur, my mind replaying everything that had happened in the last 24 hours. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel, knuckles white as I clutched it tightly, as if the act of driving was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. The sheriff hadn't believed me. No one would. I knew that now, and I was starting to wonder if, in the harsh light of day, I would even believe myself. But I did believe, because I had seen it. I had felt it. I pulled into the dirt driveway of the small cabin I rented on the outskirts of town, a place I'd always considered a sanctuary, a quiet, peaceful spot where I could clear my head. But now, the sight of the trees looming behind it, the thick forest stretching into the distance, sent a chill down my spine. What had once been comforting now felt oppressive. The woods no longer seemed like a peaceful retreat, they felt like a threat. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, staring out at the dense line of trees. Every rustle of leaves, every movement of shadow made my pulse quicken, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, was still out there watching. With a deep breath, I forced myself out of the truck and made my way to the front door. My legs were still shaky, and my muscles ached from the ordeal. My entire body screamed for rest, but I knew sleep wouldn't come. Not after what I had been through. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, shutting it behind me with more force than necessary. The familiar surroundings of the cabin, its worn furniture, the smell of wood and pine, should have been comforting, but all I could think about was how fragile the walls were, how easily that thing could break through them if it wanted to. The silence inside the cabin was unnerving. I walked over to the window, pulling the curtains aside just enough to peek out at the tree line again. The woods stretched out in front of me, dark and impenetrable. I half expected to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows, but the forest was still, peaceful. For now. I let the curtain fall back and sat down on the couch, burying my face in my hands. The exhaustion was starting to catch up to me, my body begging for rest, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, the massive, hulking figure of the creature, the way it had moved through the trees with a terrifying speed and purpose, the way it had stared at me, as if I were nothing more than prey. I leaned back, staring up at the ceiling. My heart pounded in my chest, a constant reminder that I had survived, barely. But the fear clung to me like a second skin, and no amount of rational thinking could shake it. I was safe here, wasn't I? There was no way it had followed me. It couldn't have crossed the river. Could it? A creak from the floorboards above made me jump, my body tensing up immediately. I shot a glance toward the ceiling, holding my breath, but there was nothing. Just the house settling. Nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That somehow it was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. My mind was playing tricks on me. I knew that, but the fear was too overwhelming to ignore. I walked over to the small kitchen and opened one of the cabinets, pulling out a bottle of whiskey. My hands were still shaking as I unscrewed the cap and poured myself a generous amount. The burn of the alcohol as it slid down my throat helped settle my nerves, if only a little. I leaned against the counter, staring down into the glass. I couldn't go on like this, jumping at every sound, expecting that thing to show up at my doorstep. But what else could I do? No one believed me. I couldn't go back to the campsite. Even if I did, there was no telling if the creature would be there or if it had already moved on. And even if it was still there, what could I do about it? I had nothing, no way to prove what I had seen, no way to fight it if it came after me again. The sheriff would send someone out, eventually. They'd find the destroyed campsite, maybe even the claw marks on the trees. But they'd write it off as a bear attack or some other animal. They'd never believe the truth. And that was the worst part. I was completely alone with this knowledge. I had faced something unimaginable, something that shouldn't exist, and no one would ever believe me. I'd be the guy with the wild story, the crazy camper who thought he saw Bigfoot. Bigfoot. The word sounded ridiculous in my mind, but that's what it was, wasn't it? Or something like it. I didn't know what to call it, but whatever it wasn't just some legend. It was real. I downed the rest of the whiskey and set the glass on the counter, staring out the window again. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, peaceful and quiet. But I knew better now. The peace was a lie. The danger was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the forest, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the yard. The light was fading, and with it, the safety I had clung to all day. My heart began to race again, and I could feel the familiar chill creeping down my spine. I walked over to the front door and locked it, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. I grabbed the hunting knife I had found at the campsite from my pack and set it on the table beside the couch, within easy reach. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, the cabin was swallowed by darkness. I sat on the couch, the knife by my side, staring out the window into the night. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the house sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I was safe here, I told myself, but I didn't believe it. Not really, because I knew the truth now. That thing, whatever it was still out there, and it would always be out there, a shadow in the night, a monster lurking just beyond the edge of reason. I might have escaped this time, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over, and it never would be.